Hi, my name is Kelly Thorne. I'm a historian based in Cornwall, and this is a presentation called What Are Cornish Boys to Do? And this is based on my late father's folder and photographs which he left documenting his mining career here in Cornwall in the tin mines and also in many mines abroad that the Cornish miners went to. Now this is from the period of 1969 up until the 90s, and what's extraordinary about the documents that he left, that he's literally kept so much stuff, and this gives us so much insight into the life of a miner at that time. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you through this book. This book is available as a free download on our website. It's also available through Krensen Kernow, the Cornish archives, and the full collection of everything that my late father left is also in Krensen Kernow. So my late father's name is Jeff Thorne, and this is the Jeff Thorne collection. So one thing my dad left before he died was an alternative CV. He called it a biography of experience, and he really documented all the different jobs he had, but also some of the other roles he had, for instance in the trade unions, in the fight to save the mines from being closed. So it was a great example for historians who are studying this period, who want to know more about the life of a miner and also all the other aspects of their life as well, and also their fights to keep the mines open. So we start my father's journey in South Crofty Mine in 1969, where you see here he is pictured aged only 20 years old doing his training. Quite an extraordinary photo considering the time and photography technology. So he started underground as a labourer to the timberman, which is the mine carpenter. So at this time he was very young, and at 20 he also got married, and there was some turbulence in moving to Plymouth, and then he came back down again and he started his training and he bought his first home. Kind of crazy that miners in these days who weren't on very much money were able to buy homes so easily at such an age. So that really tells us something about the time. So he became a leading miner, driller and shot firer by the age of 22. Next, he moved over to Wheal Pendarvis mine. This was in 1973. He worked there till 1976. So over in Pendarvis, this was a new mine that had opened in Cornwall. The morale at South Crofty, he said, was very low at the time. The wages were very low. So around 50 miners had left. So he followed. He said it was at the wrong moment, as they weren't actual vacancies that week. So rather embarrassingly, he then had to go back to Crofty for a while. But then he did return over to Pendarvis, and he worked there as a driller and shot firer until 1974. So he worked with another friend called John Darville at Pendarvis. He lost touch with John in the 80s, but the really sad thing was that we think that my father died of radon poisoning, and also John Darville died of the same radon poisoning just 3 days later. It is suspected, although we cannot prove, that this may have been from Pendarvis mine. They may have broken into a pocket. It seems like there were a large amount of men that died of the same type of cancer related to radon that all worked on that particular shift. He does talk about how the mining practices were that, we work in pairs, and he does talk later on in life about how there were some issues with ventilation. There were no respiratory protection during his time working there. They would only wear goggles and helmets and safety boots. So the mine itself, even back then, they kind of realised that, it was dangerous. There were lots of cave-ins as well, which is obviously extremely dangerous and potentially fatal. Now, I did speak to somebody who did the radon checks in the mines, and he said that in Pendarvis, but down on level 5, that he once took a radon measure and it was 800 times the legal limit. Of course, this period of time that my father worked there was before the legal limit was in place. That wasn't until the early 80s. So when they worked there, they would have been none the wiser. After he finished his work there, he decided to sell up, and they were offered work in Australia for a mining company. So they went there, and after only 6 months in Australia, he then returned and went back to Pendarvis. Here's the period where he was in Australia. He had my mother and my 2 older sisters with him at the time. This is a picture here. You can see him at Perth. They really lived in a place that was really out in the sticks. It was a mining village. Obviously, there was some other, the whole town was sort of revolved around sort of mining. And he says that the conditions were very dangerous. He said it was very odd that they were made to kind of go out on their own. He would go for miles out on his own, which he found was very dangerous. And he also felt that they used very old, outdated practices. And considering he'd come from a very dated and dangerous mine at Pendelvis anyway, so it was certainly extremely dangerous, and the techniques and equipment were very different than what he was used to. He didn't like that, so that was one of the reasons why they packed up and came home. By the end of 1976, 2 new mines had opened for production. So he moved to Mount Wellington Mine. Mount Wellington Mine was had modern equipment and methods used by the Canadian company. So that was similar to what he had in Australia, but this was much better, he felt. Overall experience contributed to his first promotion. So because he'd been quite experienced, he was promoted. He was appointed an underground shift boss there, and he managed working 3 levels, supervised around 30 miners. At weekends, he would have sole charge of the mine, which was often flooding, and there was again lots of emergency pumps and pipes that were draining all the time. There was threats of water actually coming and the mine closing. So again, these are very dangerous mines. Although things seem to have improved with the modern equipment use and stuff, it was still a very dangerous mine. In 1978, Goldfields closed the adjoining and larger Wheeljane mines. Unable to cope with the incoming water, Mount Wellington also closed, and they were all made redundant. We can see here some of his documents. This is really interesting for historians' purposes because we can see what he was paid. So as a shift boss, bear in mind this was as a boss, he at Mount Wellington, he was paid £5,534 per annual. So he worked 8 hours Monday to Friday. So this kind of tells you a little bit. He had meal breaks, 20 minutes per day. So it sounds like it was extremely hard work. He had 20 days annual holiday. So it tells you something about sort of the pay conditions at that time and kind of what the level of, was expected of people in terms of their holiday leave. You can also see here just a document just about his shot firer's certificate. After Wellington and being made redundant, he went to work in Angola. So this South African Angola Charter subsidiaries, the South African Angola Charter subsidiaries, MATS, was recruiting for diamond mines. So he ended up being a mine supervisor in working in an Angolan diamond mine. This was very different. It was a huge culture shock to him. The country was at brink of a civil war. Lots of Cornish miners went and worked there. You can kind of see from these photos, they had a little community of them that was there. So what he liked about it is it was basically tax-free money. Although it wasn't well paid, having that tax-freeness, being able to send that back was obviously one of the plus points. He did learn a bit of Portuguese while he was there, and ran several different operations, supervising heavy plant operations in the field and the separation plants. So again, this gave him, really good different work experience that all added to his CV. He found that the living and food conditions were unsurprisingly very basic, but the experience of living in a third world African country taught him so much and really made him feel very grateful about what we had back in the UK. Now this is really interesting. So on the left here, we've just got the document proving about his work there. But on the right here, we've actually got a letter that he wrote to resign. So please accept my resignation, he writes. And he details in this letter sort of the four main points of why he's left. So one, he said it was very poor organisation, administration from the company. Two, he said that the company expects its Angolan employees to work harder to increase production, but does not supply them adequate food to give them to sustain the stamina of the work. So that's really interesting that he felt so passionate in his resignation as to stand up for the Angolan people who he could see were being really badly exploited. And then three, he said that there are not enough numbers of machines in good working order to meet the production levels and targets set. So that obviously led to frustration. And then lastly, that he has been badly treated, he felt, moved around from one mine to another, which gave him instability. So that tells us something about what Cornish miners encountered when they worked in some of these foreign mines and what some of the conditions were like. After that, he went to Ireland and Scotland. So this was, he flitted around. So he's moving around quite a lot at this point. And obviously, although he went to Angola on his own, sometimes he would also take the family. So our family actually moved to Scotland. This was prior to my birth. So my mother and my two sisters accompanied to Scotland. These photographs are in the Scotland mine. So he got invited there by a few of his Cornwall mining friends. Again, people were, sort of going all over the place. One of them wrote to him while he was in Angola and offered him pay of £300 per week. And I accepted starting in August 1979. £300 per week, that sounds quite a lot. If you think at Wellington, he was being paid like $5,500 a year. So £300 per week must have seemed like an awful lot of money at that time. They had a problem with a particular job, and he says that he was able to do a 100-metre rise going upwards at 70 degrees, and he completed this. So he obviously was very skilled at this point. His, work experience, had sort of got him headhunted to come over to this particular work, and he was obviously pulling it off well. But, it was really dragging our family around, and that was one of the factors which led them to leave and come home. So then he starts work at Wheel Jane Mine. So this is when things get interesting. So he comes back to Wheel Jane Mine. This was after briefly working in Plymouth. He ended up coming to this reopened mine in Cornwall. It was owned by RTZ, and it was open for miners' production work. The work he did there was for 8 years as a driver and shop firer. He declined many promotions because obviously he was well skilled. He could easily have got a promotion, but he had previous history of being a shift boss. But he said that the earnings were better if he worked because he was able to do different shifts, which suited him better. So he chose to stay as a driver and shop firer. He did become a shop steward and later conveyor chairman, serving on the Works Advisory Committee and Safety Committee. So he did get those bits of experience, and he obviously became a union rep as well. He got very involved in the campaign to save the Cornish mines in the 1985 tin price crash. He also worked for the Labour Party, and he ran as a local councillor, although he didn't get that, but he worked as a chair in the local Labour Party. So all of this period was very heavy in, politics of the time, the 80s, the Thatcher years. So these were very interesting times. So he actually helped organise and did the publicity for marches, the march that happened and the parliamentary lobbying that occurred at that time. So there were negotiations with the Department of Trade and the Common Market Commissions in Brussels as well. So he travelled to London to a select committee in 1986, and he also after that went to Brussels as well. When they went to London's parliamentary committee, he was the representative for Wheel Jane. There was also a representative there for Giva, Pendarvis and South Crofty. So the four men all went with some other reps as well, and they were able to get 25 million in government aid, which was pretty impressive. They were the only industry to get that kind of money out of the Thatcher government, so it's pretty impressive. They were able to get that, but it didn't actually save the mines. RTZ decided to pull out anyway. He accepted voluntary redundancy, and he was aware that the mine was almost exhausted. So Geever and Crofty were the last two. So Pendarvis and Will-Jane shut quite quickly. And then it was down to Geever and South Crofty. Of course, then Geever folded, and South Crofty was then the last tin mine. So we can see here when he went to the Parliament, here's the photograph here. He is the man with the bushy hair and the moustache at the back. In front of him there, we've got Bernie, who represented South Crofty. We've got Mick, who represented Geever. And I've also got John Foster, who represented Pendarvis. So there are the men who came, and a lot of other local politicians came up at the time as well. So we've got the Trade and Industry Committee there. You see they've written to my father there, thanking him for coming. We've got other information in the archives collection detailing this, and the minutes and everything as well. So here we can see some of the publicity. The Morning Star wrote to my father and thanked him for his interview that they found obviously very interesting. And then also there's him on the front page of the West Briton of the time. So you can see him there with his hat, obviously celebrating the 25 million in rescue packages. So, you know, this shows how optimistic everyone was at this time, and how much sort of media interest there were. I mean, you know, this was making the press all over the place, but obviously the fight wasn't won, and inevitably things folded anyway. So what did he do after redundancy at Will-Jane? He accepted work in the Sudan. So off he went again on his own, left us. I was born at this point. So here he was in Sudan. So he worked there for... I seem to remember 2 times for a period. It was obviously very good money. I remember the letters that he sent. He obviously this was around the time where his marriage broke down to my mother. So our family was breaking up at this point anyway. So he took that opportunity to go away, earn some extra money, which he was sending back to us. He went to work as a supervisor and a trainer in the Gilbert gold mines. This is a gold mine now, so this is another type of mineral. So this adds again to his experience. He found Sudan so interesting. He loved being in North Africa, often talked about it afterwards. He decided to return to Devon, where he found work by placing adverts in the newspaper. So after this kind of was like one of the last mining jobs. So after this, you know, Cornwall was pretty much exhausted. There really wasn't a lot there. So them going to Sudan was kind of like one of the last things that they did. And a lot of the Cornish miners went. We've got other miners that went from Geever and all of the others. So this was quite a big opportunity, but from what I hear from a lot of his friends who I've spoken to since, it was quite hard. They were, you know, they had very little contact with anybody, and, you know, it was really lonely out there. You know, they were right out in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't anything going on. It was quite depressing and quite hard going. And I think if you were at the time in quite a down period in your life, especially with everything that had gone on at home, with the economy, the mines closing, lots of people's marriages were breaking up because of these similar sort of things. You know, it was pretty tough going for them. Here is a letter that he wrote to me. So this kind of tells you and shows sort of his sadness. He, you know, he says about how much he missed me, and he hopes that, he says in here, I miss you very much, and one day I hope I do not have to work away and we'll be together again. So it kind of shows his sadness, this letter, and that kind of gives you a flavour of kind of how they were feeling when they were away from home for so long. You can see there's a picture of his desk. It's got a picture of me and my sisters on it. And you can see their Christmas table where they're all trying to obviously make the best of it, and they all got together. So yeah, I think this was quite a sort of yes, it was quite prosperous in terms of it was good money and stuff, but I don't think it was a particularly nice experience. So after that, my dad had a few different jobs, you know, in Plymouth, did a few different things. He ran a job club in Newton Abbot for a while. He did some various random different things. And then he did actually return for one last stint at South Crofty, which is ironic because at this point Crofty was the last mine open, and it was also the first mine that he started in. So he kind of ended where he started. So he went back to South Crofty. He worked there for like not much, less than a year. And, you know, the pay was extremely bad by this point. Morale was very low. They kind of knew where it was going. And he left because, you know, there wasn't much prospects. And also he'd remarried in Plymouth. So he went back to his wife there. And then very randomly after that, he went to Turkey to work. So after Plymouth, he then moved to the Midlands and was doing a few different odd jobs. And then he got asked to go out of the blue by some old Cornish mining friends to go to Turkey. So they went there, and they went for, it was only about 6 weeks, all expenses paid, but they found out they weren't actually paid, and they found out they were working illegally. So he came home from that, but he actually had a great time. But one thing he says here is that they all knew that their Cornish mining days was nothing more than nostalgia now. It was over. So this was really he says, describes it as a really nice reunion with old mining acquaintances that he really enjoyed. So this was kind of a positive trip, but I mean, this was literally very much the end of his mining career. So after that, obviously South Crofty mine closed in 1998. It has now reopened, so the story continues. But yes, it did close in 1998, and the whole site fell into disrepair. You can see a photograph I took there in 2012. The whole site really fell in on itself, and the mine, of course, flooded. But that has now reopened, and obviously now has what seems like going to be a prosperous future. So we'll wait and see what happens to Crofty Mine. As for my father, he worked in Evesham. He did various different jobs, and then he also did his degree as well. He went to Warwick University and studied and got his degree. So that was a really positive thing that he wanted to achieve. But he found out in 2011, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And again, that was from the radon exposure. And as I said earlier, you know, he found that out, and we didn't know, but 3 days after he passed, John Darville also passed as well. So really sad that we've lost so many people in Cornwall to radon exposure. It's very little talked about it, very little research done on the issue. But yes, we do know that, you know, the mines were heavily exposed, and especially those miners who worked before the legal laws were put in place, they, you know, did suffer that exposure. And all of those years later, then it affected their health. But all said and done, my father was very clear that he loved his mining career. I don't think he regretted any of it, even at the end. So I think that this is a sort of, and the fact that he documented it and kept everything also shows how much he loved and was nostalgic for that period. So again, we've collated all of the documents, and there's lots of documents and there's lots of photos as well. And they are all on Krensen Kernow. You can go and view the collection online, and you can also view the collection in person in Krensen Kernow in Redruth in Cornwall. I will put a link in the description to this video. If they've got any questions, do contact me. I'd love to hear from anybody that knew my father. It's always nice to hear. And if you are somebody that did work during that period and you'd like to contribute to our collection, that would be a really positive thing to do, and I'd be happy to help you do that. So if you've got anything you want to contribute, please let me know, or contact Krensen Kernow directly.